Can you live your life in the shadow of a statue? Can a wooden statue become more than just a work of art? In Drowne's Wooden Image, the famous tale by Nathaniel Hawthorne reimagined in English, we uncover a haunting story of obsession where art, life, and the darker shades of the human soul collide. Join us at Classic Storytime Hub for a journey filled with mystery and suspense as we bring classic literature to life in fresh, exciting ways.
It was a bright and promising morning in old Boston, where the air buzzed with the sounds of the bustling port. Drowne, a young woodcarver known for his precision and skill, stood in front of a massive oak log, his mind swirling with possibilities. This was no ordinary piece of wood. It was destined to become the figurehead of a ship. He ran his fingers over the grain, imagining what shape would best capture the soul of the vessel. As Drowne mulled over the possibilities, the door to his workshop creaked open and a broad-shouldered figure stepped in. Captain Honeywell, a man known for his charm and boisterous nature, strode in with a purposeful air. He owned the Cynosure, a brig that had just returned from its first voyage to the faraway island of Fayal. "Ah, that's the one," the captain declared, pointing at the log with enthusiasm. He struck it lightly with his rattan cane. "This very piece, this is what I want for the Cynosure. She's the finest ship to ever cut through the waves, and by God, I intend for her to have the finest figurehead. You, Drowne, are the only man I trust to carve it." Drowne looked up, his brow furrowing slightly, though his pride in his craft glinted in his eyes. "You flatter me, Captain," his tone modest but confident. "But for the Cynosure, I'll give it my all. Now, as for the design, what do you think of these?" He gestured to a few sketches spread across the table, each one a different image, a regal figure in a white wig and a scarlet coat, a heroic Admiral Vernon, and, for a touch of grace, Britannia holding her trident. The captain's smile widened, but it was a smile tinged with mystery. "All good ideas, Drowne, but none of them fit the Cynosure. She's a ship like no other, and her figurehead needs to be like no other too. Old Neptune himself would never have seen anything like it." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper, too soft and confidential to repeat aloud. Whatever he was about to reveal was meant for the carver's ears alone, a secret wrapped in mystery. But as the captain spoke, Drowne couldn't help but feel the weight of the words. There was something off about the way the captain carried himself, something urgent, hidden beneath his jovial exterior. While the captain's cryptic words lingered in the air, let's take a moment to learn more about the man who would carve the Cynosure's mysterious figurehead. Drowne wasn't just any carver. He was, in fact, the first American to attempt such an art form, though at the time it was a humble beginning. His reputation had spread slowly but steadily, and his name was known, though not yet famous, by those who appreciated the craft. From a young age, Drowne had shown an uncanny talent, not quite genius, but certainly something rare. He had a knack, as the locals would call it, for mimicking the human figure in whatever material he could get his hands on. In the harsh winters of New England, he had used the snow as his medium, shaping statues that sparkled like marble. They weren't permanent like stone, but their beauty was undeniable. In fact, adults were often impressed by his creations, even though they lacked the warmth and life that would have made them seem alive. His snow statues, though fleeting, were admired by those who recognized the boy's skill. But they were fragile, like dreams, melting away with the first thaw. As Drowne grew older, he refined his craft. Pine and oak replaced snow, and he began to carve more solid, enduring works. His talent brought him recognition and eventually money. He carved ornate pump heads,
wooden urns for gateposts, and intricate decorations that adorned mantelpieces. In fact, no apothecary in the town considered their shop complete without a gilded mortar or a bust of Galen or Hippocrates, all expertly crafted by Drowne's hands. His name was becoming synonymous with fine woodcraft, and his reputation spread, not just among the townsfolk, but anyone who valued true craftsmanship. But little did he know that his next creation would thrust him into a world of secrets, a world where the line between art and obsession blurred, and where the past would collide with a future he never saw coming.
The heart of Drowne's work, the true measure of his craft, lay in the creation of figureheads for ships. They were no ordinary sculptures, they were symbols of power, grandeur, and identity. Whether it was a regal monarch, a legendary British admiral, a colonial governor, or even the beloved daughter of a wealthy shipowner, Drowne's figures stood proudly above the prow, painted in brilliant hues, gilded with gold, and staring out to sea with an air of undeniable superiority, as if they were fully aware of their own magnificence. These works of art sailed far and wide, crossing oceans, gracing the ships of New England's mariners, and earning their place among the bustling ships of the Thames and countless other ports where the daring sailors had made their mark. Yet, for all their fame, a subtle pattern emerged. Each figurehead, though distinct, shared a family resemblance. The king's face, noble yet distant, seemed to resemble that of his subjects. Miss Peggy Hobart, the merchant's daughter, bore a striking similarity to Britannia, Victory, and other allegorical figures, as if she'd stepped out of the pages of a myth. But there was something else, something subtle yet undeniable. They all had a certain wooden quality, as if the very grain of the timber had left its mark on the faces, reminding anyone who looked too closely that these figures, no matter how finely crafted, were still made of raw wood. There was skill, to be sure, immense skill, but no magic, no spark, no life. They were cold, lifeless, like frozen memories caught in time. Drowne's work was admired, but it lacked that deeper touch, the kind of soul or spark of intellect that could breathe life into the lifeless. He carved, but it was always as if the final breath, the last flicker of spirit eluded him. Then, as the captain of the cynosure finished speaking, the mood in the workshop shifted. His instructions were clear and heavy with meaning. And Drowne, Captain Honeywell's voice dropped, more serious now, you must put everything else aside and focus on this task. I need it done without delay. And as for payment, do the job right and you'll name your price. No questions asked. Drowne nodded slowly, a grave expression crossing his face. He was a master of his craft, yet the captain's words seemed to weigh on him more than usual. There was a complexity to the task that tugged at his thoughts, something unsettling. But the promise of a generous reward was enough to steel his resolve. "Very well, Captain," Drowne said, the hint of a smile still present, but it was one laced with uncertainty. "I will do my utmost to satisfy you." From that moment on, the men of taste who frequented the bustling Long Wharf and town dock began to notice something strange about Drowne. These were the same men who had once admired his skill with a knowing nod, stopping by his workshop to praise his wooden creations. But now, something was different. There was a subtle shift in his behavior, a kind of secrecy that hadn't been there before. Drowne, the ever-present carver, was now often absent during the day, yet there were whispers about his workshop late into the night. Gleams of light would flicker from the windows as though the shop were alive with activity. Visitors would knock, sometimes shout, but no answer ever came. The door remained shut, and no word was spoken in return. The shop, once open and welcoming, had turned into something far more elusive. When the shop was open, nothing about it seemed out of the ordinary at first. It was just another typical scene: wood shavings scattered across the floor, tools hanging neatly on the walls, and the faint scent of oak in the air. But there was one particular piece of timber that caught the attention of the regulars, a fine, solid chunk of oak, one that Drowne had apparently set aside for something special. Day after day, it seemed to grow, slowly taking shape, but no one could say what it was meant to be, not the shop's visitors, not even Drowne himself. As time passed, the mystery only deepened. Though the carver was seldom seen working directly on the piece, the figure was slowly emerging, a form, a silhouette. As the days went by, the pile of wooden ships grew higher, and the shape took on a clearer form, a female figure, delicately carved, as if she were somehow awakening from the timber itself. It was as if the spirit of the oak had been hiding within its bark, waiting for the right hand to release her from her wooden prison. For all the imperfections in her design, the image was becoming more than just a carving. It was a mystery, a work of art that pulled the eye away from Drowne's previous creations with their sharp edges and clean lines, and drew it towards something deeper, something perhaps only Drowne could understand. The mystery had only just begun, and already the question hung in the air. Who was this woman carved from wood, and what had driven Drowne to work on her in such secrecy?
It was on a quiet afternoon that Copley, the celebrated young painter of Boston, decided to pay a visit to Drowne. Though the carver was still relatively unknown outside of his craft, Copley had seen enough to recognize the budding talent in him. In a city where professional camaraderie could sometimes be scarce, the painter sought to cultivate a connection, intrigued by the unusual artistry Drowne was producing. As he stepped into the workshop, Copley's eyes swept across the familiar collection of wooden figures, each one lifeless in its own way. The king, the admiral, the lady of allegory, they stood frozen, their wooden forms stark and rigid. They looked almost alive, in a sense, but it was an unsettling kind of life, one that had the essence of a human being, but none of the spirit. There was a stolid, lifeless quality to them, as if the carving had captured only the shell of a person, leaving the mind and soul behind. The wood hadn't imbibed humanity's warmth or vibrancy. It was as though the figures were mere imitations, copies without any spark of the living. Copley observed this for a moment, his trained eye catching the subtle yet undeniable flaw. He turned toward Drowne, a smile tugging at the corners of his lips, but with a hint of something else. Curiosity, perhaps, or even a bit of sympathy for the carver. "My friend Drowne," said Copley, his voice light but measured, "you are truly a remarkable man. I can't think of another in your line of work who's achieved so much with so little. If you had just one more touch, the kind you know I mean, it would transform this figure of General Wolfe into a living, breathing man. Imagine that." Drowne's gaze flickered briefly toward the image of General Wolfe, but the sight clearly displeased him. He turned away, his back stiff with frustration. There was no admiration in his eyes, only a deep, quiet discontent. "You think you are praising me, Mr. Copley," replied Drowne, his voice tinged with bitterness, though it held a certain resignation. "But the truth is, I have seen it. I know exactly what you mean. The one touch you speak of, the one that would make my work truly come alive, it is the one that has eluded me. And without it, these creations of mine are nothing more than empty shells. They're no better than worthless imitations." He paused, a flicker of something dark crossing his face, as if the weight of his own words was settling in. "The difference between my work and the work of a true artist, Mr. Copley, is the same as the difference between a crude signpost and one of your finest paintings. It is the soul, the life that I cannot seem to capture, and without it, all my skill is for nothing." There was a long, tense silence. Copley, though he had intended to compliment the carver, now found himself standing on the edge of something deeper, something that Drowne seemed to understand all too well.
The young painter could see it in Drowne's eyes. The carver was no longer just frustrated by his limitations. There was something darker there, something that hinted at an obsession with the perfect touch, the elusive spark that could make his creations truly come alive. And Copley, for all his praise, began to wonder, was Drowne chasing a dream that would never be realized? Or was he on the verge of something that could change everything? Copley studied Drowne closely, his gaze narrowing as he noticed something new in Drowne's expression. There was a depth there now, something he hadn't seen before. It was as if Drowne's face had suddenly come alive, as if the very wood he had been shaping was beginning to infuse him with a subtle intelligence. But it was strange. This newfound depth wasn't present in any of his previous works. The wooden figures in the shop still held their cold, lifeless forms, as though they too had been trapped in some mechanical illusion. "This is strange," said Copley, his voice tinged with both curiosity and concern. "How is it that now, when you understand the very flaw in your art, you continue to create such lifeless things?" Drowne's lips curled into a faint smile, but he said nothing. He simply stood there, silent. It was as though the question had no answer, or perhaps the answer was too vast to be spoken. Copley turned his attention back to the figures, all the while contemplating Drowne's words. There was something in Drowne's expression, a rare self-awareness that hinted at a kind of genius buried deep beneath the surface. But as he examined the figures again, all he could see was wood, cold and unyielding. He was about to leave, the mystery unresolved, when his gaze fell on something unexpected. In the far corner of the workshop, a half-formed figure caught his eye. It lay among the scattered chips of oak, its shape rough but undeniable. It was as though a spark had been lit beneath the wood, something that transcended the mechanical precision of the other works. The moment Copley saw it, he was frozen. This wasn't just another figure. This was something different. "What is this?" he gasped, stepping forward, his voice barely a whisper of astonishment. "Who did this? Whose work is this?" Drowne, who had been standing at a distance, responded quietly, almost cryptically, "No man's work. The figure lies within that block of oak, and it is my job to find it." Copley stared at him for a moment, then, overcome by a sudden realization, grabbed Drowne's hand with an intensity that surprised both of them. "Drowne, you are a man of genius." As Copley turned to leave, his eyes briefly flickered back toward the corner of the workshop. There, he saw Drowne once more, leaning over the unfinished figure, his arms stretched toward it as if he were trying to pull the lifeless form to him, as if he wanted to embrace it, to breathe life into it with his own passion. It was a moment so charged with emotion that it seemed to fill the room with a heat that contrasted sharply with the cold, unmoving wood. "Strange," Copley murmured to himself as he stepped out into the crisp air. Who would have expected to find a modern-day Pygmalion in the form of a Yankee mechanic? At first, the figure was nothing more than a vague suggestion, a faint outline that stirred the imagination more than it satisfied the eye. It lay among the scattered chips of oak, its shape rough but undeniable. It was as though a spark had been lit beneath the wood, something that transcended the mechanical precision of the other works. The moment Copley saw it, he was frozen. This wasn't just another figure. This was something different. "What is this?" he gasped, stepping forward, his voice barely a whisper of astonishment. "Who did this? Whose work is this?" Drowne, who had been standing at a distance, responded quietly, almost cryptically, "No man's work. The figure lies within that block of oak, and it is my job to find it." Copley stared at him for a moment, then, overcome by a sudden realization, grabbed Drowne's hand with an intensity that surprised both of them. "Drowne, you are a man of genius." As Copley turned to leave, his eyes briefly flickered back toward the corner of the workshop.
There he saw Drowne once more, leaning over the unfinished figure, his arms stretched toward it as if he were trying to pull the lifeless form to him, as if he wanted to embrace it, to breathe life into it with his own passion. It was a moment so charged with emotion that it seemed to fill the room with a heat that contrasted sharply with the cold, unmoving wood. Strange, Copley murmured to himself as he stepped out into the crisp air. Who would have expected to find a modern-day Pygmalion in the form of a Yankee mechanic? At first, the figure was nothing more than a vague suggestion, a faint outline that stirred the imagination more than it satisfied the eye. It was like the soft, shifting shapes that appeared in the clouds as the sun set over the western horizon, something elusive, more felt than seen. Yet with each passing day, Drowne's work began to take form. The blurry edges of the sculpture gradually smoothed out, as if the wood itself were waking from a dream, revealing its true shape beneath the rough-hewn surface. The transformation was slow, but it was undeniable. Soon, even the most casual observer could make out the design, a woman, elegant and foreign in her appearance. Her gown was laced tightly across the chest, parting in the front to reveal a skirt that cascaded down in perfectly captured folds. Every curve, every line of the fabric seemed to breathe life, as though the wood itself had somehow absorbed the texture and movement of cloth. The dress was unlike anything seen in New England, its style too exotic, too refined. And yet the depiction was so precise, so convincingly real, that it was impossible not to believe the artist had drawn inspiration from something he had seen in the flesh. Her hat was a thing of grace, adorned with flowers that bloomed in a riot of colors, flowers that could never have grown in the harsh soil of the North. Yet in Drowne's hands they seemed to spring to life with such authenticity that the most imaginative mind could not have conceived them without having seen something like them before. Little details, elegant but unassuming, added to the richness of the figure. A fan, delicately sculpted, rested in one hand. A pair of earrings dangled at her ears, a chain wrapped around her neck. A watch peeked from beneath the folds of her gown, and a ring gleamed on her finger. To the untrained eye, these might have seemed beneath the dignity of a sculpture, but to those who appreciated the nuances of true beauty, they added a layer of realism that was nothing short of mesmerizing. Drowne had crafted these small touches with the same care a woman might take in dressing for the day, and they brought the figure to life in ways that transcended conventional artistic rules. But it was the face that truly held the power to captivate. Though still incomplete, it was clear that something extraordinary was unfolding. Through Drowne's hands, the wood seemed to come alive. The features began to take shape, but it was the subtle magic in the carving that made the face truly shine. It was as though light itself poured from within the oak, illuminating the delicate contours of the face. The expression that emerged was one of beauty, imperfect, yes, but undeniably striking. The face was somewhat haughty, with an almost regal air, yet there was a playfulness in the eyes, a subtle, knowing curve of the lips that made it impossible to believe this was simply a wooden sculpture. It was a look that could melt the heart of anyone who met it, and yet it seemed utterly impossible for a mere block of oak to convey such complexity. And so, as the final touches were carved, it became clear to all who gazed upon it, this was no ordinary piece of art. This was something beyond the bounds of craftsmanship, a creation that seemed to have been touched by something divine. The figure, for all intents and purposes, was complete, but Drowne knew there was still one more piece of the puzzle to solve. The figure was alive, but only in the eyes of the carver.
Copley had become a regular visitor to Drowne's workshop, almost as if he couldn't stay away. Each day he found himself more captivated by the mysterious transformation unfolding in the carver's hands, and now, standing before the nearly completed figure, he was struck by the sheer brilliance of it. "Drowne," he said, his voice filled with awe, "if this were marble, you would be famous overnight. In fact, I would go as far as to say it could mark a new era in the world of art.
It's as ideal as any ancient statue, and yet it's as real as a woman you could meet at a fireside or on the street. But tell me, I trust you're not planning to ruin this exquisite creation with paint like those gaudy kings and admirals on your other works?" Before Drowne could respond, Captain Honeywell, who had been quietly watching the conversation unfold, burst in with his own opinion. "Not paint her," he exclaimed, his voice rising. "Not the figurehead of the cynosure. What kind of impression would I make in a foreign port with such a plain, unpainted thing hanging over my prow? No, she must be painted, and painted to perfection, every detail, from the flowers on her hat to the silver spangles on her slippers." Drowne, calm and collected, turned to face them both. His eyes seemed to carry a quiet storm behind them, but his voice was steady, almost too steady as he spoke. "Mr. Copley," he said, almost reverently, "I know nothing about marble statues, nor the rules that sculptors follow. But when it comes to this wooden figure, this work of my hands, this creature of my heart," his voice faltered as if the weight of what he was saying had taken him by surprise, "of her I know something. A wisdom has filled me, a kind of truth that comes from deep inside. As I carved her, with every stroke, I poured my strength, my soul, and my faith into her. If others choose to follow the rules of marble or sculpting, let them. But if I can breathe life into this wood through my hands, through paint or not, then those rules are not for me, and I have every right to disregard them." Copley, watching this moment unfold, could hardly contain the thoughts swirling in his mind. "The very spirit of genius," he muttered to himself, more in awe than anything else. "How else could a man like Drowne feel entitled to break all the rules of art, and in doing so make me feel ashamed of quoting them?" He looked again at Drowne, and once more he saw it, the expression that had drawn him to this man in the first place. There in the carver's eyes was something more than skill, more than talent. It was the deep, abiding love for his creation, a love that transcended the physical work and spilled over into something almost spiritual. Copley couldn't help but think that it was this very love, this human connection, that had breathed life into the block of wood, something no mere rule of art could ever capture. The carver, maintaining the same air of secrecy that had shrouded his work from the very beginning, set to work painting the figure's clothes in their true colors, bringing to life the gown and the delicate details of the face with nature's red and white. When the final brushstroke was done, when the last touch of paint had dried, Drowne threw open the doors of his workshop and invited the townspeople in to witness what he had created. At first, there was a hushed reverence. The townsfolk, crossing the threshold, found themselves instinctively removing their hats as if they were entering the presence of royalty. There, standing in the corner of the room, amidst scattered wood chips and shavings, was the figure of a beautiful young woman, dressed in rich, intricately painted clothing. She seemed almost alive, her form so strikingly real that it was difficult to believe she was made of oak. But then, as their eyes lingered on the figure, an unsettling sense of something other began to creep over them. The air in the room shifted. It was as if the woman wasn't quite human, though she looked so close to being so. There was something preternatural about her, a quality that made the spectators uneasy, though they could not pinpoint exactly why. The richness of the flowers adorning her head, flowers so vibrant and foreign they could have come from another world entirely. The deep, luminous complexion that shone far more brilliantly than any of the local women, her exotic, almost otherworldly dress, which somehow still managed to seem perfectly appropriate for the streets. Every detail about her seemed both familiar and yet impossibly strange. The fine embroidery of the skirt, the heavy gold chain draped around her neck, the elegant ring on her finger, and the delicate fan in her hand, painted to resemble pearl and ebony with a skill that defied belief. Copley stood, transfixed by the beauty of the figure. He was struck by the question, where could Drowne in his humble, sober life have seen such vision? And then her face. The expression on her face was more than just beautiful. It was magnetic, alive. In her dark eyes, a mischievous gleam flickered, and her full lips held a subtle smile that seemed to dance between pride and coquetry. There was something almost playful about it, as though she was enjoying the admiration of the gathered crowd, knowing how much she bewitched them. Copley could not tear his eyes away. He turned to Drowne, the question slipping out of his mouth before he could stop it. "And will you truly allow this masterpiece to become the figurehead of a ship? Surely give that honest captain there the figure of Britannia. It would serve his purpose much better. Send this fairy queen to England, where, for all I know, it could fetch you £1,000. Drowne stood quietly, his expression unreadable as ever. "I have not wrought it for money," he replied, his voice low, carrying a sense of finality. Copley watched Drowne, his mind racing. What sort of man is this, he thought, baffled. A Yankee, and he throws away the chance to make his fortune? He must have lost his mind. And from that madness comes this flash of genius. But the rumors swirling around Drowne only seemed to confirm Copley's suspicions. The talk in the town had become stranger by the day. It was said that Drowne had been seen kneeling before the oaken figure, gazing into her carved face with the kind of passion a lover would show, as if he were mesmerized by the very creation of his own hands. The more conservative folk, those quick to cast judgment, whispered darkly. An evil spirit, they said, must have entered the image, a devilish force taking hold of the carver's mind, drawing him toward destruction. Yet, despite the unsettling rumors, Drowne's masterpiece only grew in fame. Word of the image spread like wildfire, drawing people from every corner of the town. Within days, it seemed there wasn't a man or woman, old or young, who hadn't seen the figure with their own eyes. Even if the story of Drowne's wooden image had ended there, it would have lived on in the memories of those who had looked upon it in their youth. It would have become a fixture of the town's history, one of those tales passed down through generations, lingering in the air like smoke from the hearth. But fate had other plans. An event was about to unfold that would turn the image and Drowne's fate into something far stranger than anyone could have predicted. A legend was about to be born, one that would echo through the town's tradition for years to come. One fine morning, just as the cynosure prepared to embark on her second voyage to Fayal, a scene unfolded that no one could anticipate. The ship's captain, known to all for his sharp, confident demeanor, stepped out of his home on Hanover Street, looking every bit the part of the gallant sailor. He was dressed in a stylish blue coat, the seams and buttonholes glistening with gold lace, his scarlet waistcoat embroidered with intricate patterns, and his triangular hat adorned with a loop of gold. A silver-hilted hanger hung at his side, completing the look of a man who was ready for anything. But even in such fine attire, the captain's presence would have gone unnoticed by the townsfolk had it not been for the figure leaning on his arm. The sight of this companion, this vision, stopped the entire street in its tracks. People froze. They rubbed their eyes in disbelief, unsure of what they were seeing. Some stepped aside in confusion, while others stood rooted to the spot, as though they had turned to stone. For there, walking with the captain, was the figure from Drowne's workshop, the very image he had carved, now brought to life in a way that no one could explain. It was as though the woman from the oak had stepped out of the confines of wood and into the real world, and with her came a chill, a sense of dread and awe that crept through the onlookers. The air itself seemed to hum with the strange power of the moment. How could this be? Had the figure really come to life? Or had the captain, in some bizarre twist of fate, found a woman who could have been sculpted in Drowne's image?
"Do you see it? Do you see it?" cried one voice in a trembling hush, his eyes wide with astonishment. "It's the very same!" "The same?" replied another, who had only just arrived in town the night before, his gaze scanning the scene. "Who are you talking about? I see only a sea captain in his shore-going clothes and a young lady in a foreign dress, her hat adorned with beautiful flowers. I swear she's as fair as any woman I've seen in a long time. Yes, the same, the very same, the first man insisted, his voice quivering with excitement. Drowne's wooden image has come to life. A hush fell over the street as the townsfolk looked on in disbelief. This was no ordinary sight. Was it a miracle, or was something far darker at play? Under the morning sun, with shadows dancing along the edges of the buildings, the figure walked down the street, real, alive, and yet hauntingly familiar. It was the image they had all marveled at in Drowne's workshop, only now it had stepped out into the world. The shape, the clothing, the face, it was all there, as perfect and precise as when they had first seen it. Only now the wood had softened into something far more alive. The flowers in her hat, each one identical to the ones carved by Drowne, waved gently in the breeze, their delicate beauty now fully realized in the flesh. The rich gold chain around her neck gleamed as it rose and fell with each breath she took. The fan in her right hand, an exquisite piece of craftsmanship, painted to resemble pearl and ebony, fluttered in the air with a coquettish grace that was both enchanting and unnerving. Her face, it was the same as the images, radiant with a depth of complexion so rich it seemed almost otherworldly. There was a mischievous glint in her eyes, a playful, fleeting smile that shifted with every movement, like sunlight sparkling on the surface of a stream. It was a face that drew you in, and yet left you with a sense of unease, as if it held a secret just out of reach. She was as real as the cobblestones beneath her feet, and yet with every step she seemed to float just above the ground. It was impossible to look away. People stared, unsure whether they were witnessing a miracle or a curse. Had the magic of the oak truly been transformed into flesh? Or was this some ethereal apparition, a living spirit made flesh? "One thing's certain," muttered a Puritan, his voice dripping with suspicion. "Drowne has sold himself to the devil, and I'd wager Captain Honeywell is a part of that infernal bargain." A young man standing nearby overheard the remark and grinned mischievously. "And I," his eyes never leaving the figure, said, "would almost consider being the third victim if it meant I could kiss those lips. And I," Copley, the painter, added with a wry smile, "would gladly make that sacrifice for the privilege of capturing her likeness on canvas." The crowd followed as the apparition, or was it an apparition, accompanied by the bold Captain Honeywell, moved down the narrow, winding lanes of the town. From Hanover Street they made their way to Ann Street, then on to Dock Square, until at last they reached Drowne's shop, nestled right at the water's edge. The people, swelling in numbers, could hardly contain their awe and confusion. Never before had such a modern miracle occurred so brazenly in broad daylight and with so many witnesses. As she moved, the figure, this otherworldly vision, seemed to feel the weight of the growing murmurs, the whispers, the eyes following her every step. Her expression shifted, the playful mischief on her face turning into something more agitated, as though she was mildly vexed by the attention, yet still maintaining a coquettish air. Her fan, once a delicate work of art, fluttered so rapidly that its fragile structure shattered in her hand, the pieces falling softly to the ground. The crowd gasped, their collective breath held in anticipation. The figure, still walking in perfect grace, approached the door of Drowne's shop. The captain, ever the gentleman, flung it open, allowing her to pass first. She paused for the briefest of moments on the threshold, her stance perfectly mirroring the carved image that had once been confined to the workshop. Then, with a glance that seemed to hold a promise of mischief and mystery, she turned toward the crowd. It was the same look they had all remembered from Drowne's creation, the wooden lady's playful gaze, now brought to life in flesh.
And just like that, she and Captain Honeywell disappeared into the shop. A collective sigh of amazement escaped the crowd, as if they had been holding their breath for far too long. Ah, the sound rippled through the air like a shared exhale of wonder and fear. "The world seems a little darker now that she's gone," muttered some of the younger men, their voices filled with longing and disbelief.
But the elders, those whose memories stretched back to the days when witches roamed the land, shook their heads gravely. They exchanged knowing glances, their voices dropping to hushed whispers. Our forefathers would have thought it righteous to burn the daughter of the oak with fire, they murmured, a dark knowledge in their tone. Copley, the painter, who had been drawn into the mystery just as deeply as the rest, stepped forward. "If she is more than just a fleeting illusion," he murmured, his voice filled with a mix of wonder and disbelief, "I must see her face once more." Without a moment's hesitation, he entered the shop, his heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and dread. Inside, there she stood again. The image, the creation, exactly as he had last seen her, perched in her usual corner, staring back at him with that same mischievous glint in her eyes. It was the same expression she had worn when she turned toward the crowd just moments before, a playful yet haunting reminder of her strange, ethereal nature. Drowne was there too, standing beside the figure, mending the broken fan that had shattered in her hand. But there was something different now. The image was still, lifeless, no longer alive with that eerie energy that had possessed her during her walk down the street. The witchcraft, the magic that had stirred her, was gone. There was no woman, no spirit, no shadow to deceive the eyes, just the stillness of wood, carved with such skill that it seemed impossible to believe it was just that, wood. And Captain Honeywell? He too had disappeared, his commanding voice now muffled beyond a door that led to the water. But the moment he stepped out of sight, the eerie tension that had accompanied the apparition lifted, leaving only the quiet hum of the water lapping at the shore. "Sit down in the stern sheets, my lady," Captain Honeywell said with a flourish, his voice filled with the same bold confidence that had accompanied them throughout this strange journey. "Come, ye lubbers, give us a hand. Set us aboard in the time it takes for a minute glass to turn." And with that, the sound of oars cutting through the water echoed across the quiet street, as if the entire scene was slipping away into the fog of some half-remembered dream. Drowne, still standing there in the shadows of his workshop, was drawn back into reality by Copley's voice. "Drowne," the painter said with a knowing smile, "you've been truly fortunate man. What painter, what sculptor has ever had such a subject? No wonder she inspired a genius in you. She created the artist, who then brought her image to life." For a fleeting moment, Drowne's face seemed to flicker with the remnants of that extraordinary vision, the spark of creativity that had filled him with an almost otherworldly brilliance. But just as quickly, it vanished. He looked at Copley, his eyes hollow, as though very essence of his inspiration had been stolen from him. His face was now blank, marked by the faintest traces of tears that had dried, leaving only the worn mask of the mechanical carver. "I hardly understand what you mean, Mr. Copley," his voice distant, as he pressed his hand to his forehead, trying to clear away the confusion. "This image, can it have truly been my work? Well, I wrought it in some sort of dream, I suppose. And now that I am wide awake, I must finish this figure of Admiral Vernon." Without another word, Drowne returned to the task at hand. He bent over the lifeless form of one of his wooden creations, a cold, unremarkable likeness of Admiral Vernon, and began to carve with the same mechanical precision he had always known. The magic, the genius, had fled from him. There was nothing left but the steady rhythm of chiseling away at wood, as if he were trying to escape from the haunting memory of the lady that had once seemed to breathe with life. Years passed. Drowne, now known as Deacon Drowne, carved diligently, quietly building a modest fortune with his hands. He became a well-respected figure in his community,
his name forever linked to the sturdy, dependable work he had mastered over the years. Yet in his later life, he held a position of dignity in the church, a far cry from the artist who had once crafted a vision so beautiful it seemed to step out of the ether. One of his works, a gilded statue of an Indian chief, stood for nearly a century on the cupola of the province house, gleaming in the sunlight like some celestial being, a remnant of a time long past. Another, a small figure of Captain Honeywell, complete with telescope and quadrant, still stands today at the corner of Broad and State Streets, serving as the sign for a nautical instrument shop. Yet, despite the legacy of these pieces, there remains something unsettling about the comparison between these later works and the masterpiece of the Oaken Lady. How could the same hands that had created such life, such spirit, be capable of producing such cold, lifeless figures? Perhaps the answer lies in the very nature of human creativity itself. We all have within us that spark, the potential for imagination, for brilliance, for genius. But as Drowne's life proved, that spark is fickle. It can be nurtured by love, and it can be extinguished by disappointment, leaving behind only the dull mechanics of routine. For Drowne, his brief season of genius, ignited by the image of a woman he could never truly possess, was but a moment, a fleeting glimpse into a deeper, more powerful self. And once it was gone, he was left with only the tools of his trade, the ability to carve, but no longer the ability to create. And so the Oaken Lady, that miraculous image of beauty and life, remained forever a dream, a spark of genius that burned bright and then faded into the past, leaving behind only the echo of what could have been. And yet, who could deny that the highest state to which a human spirit can ascend, its truest, most genuine form, was the very one Drowne had reached when he carved the magnificent figure of the mysterious lady? In that moment, he was not merely the mechanic, the carver of wood. He was an artist, a creator, channeling something far beyond the ordinary. He was most true to himself then, in his brilliance and inspiration, than when he later turned to the creation of lifeless, uninspired figures that seemed to have no greater purpose than to serve as utilitarian adornments for ships and buildings. His mechanical carvings, though accomplished, were nothing more than shadows of that fleeting moment of divine creation, the Oaken Lady. In her, Drowne had unlocked a part of himself that could never be replicated. And then a whisper began to circulate through Boston, a curious rumor, one that carried with it the whispers of the sea and foreign shores. The story spread, as such stories do, half believed, half feared, growing in the telling. It was said that a young Portuguese lady of noble birth, having fallen victim to the turmoil of political or domestic unrest, had sought refuge from her homeland of Fayal. She had taken shelter with Captain Honeywell aboard his vessel, the Cynosure, and in his house, hidden away from the world until the storm of her troubles passed. Could this mysterious woman have been the very inspiration for Drowne's creation? Was she the ethereal lady that had appeared in his workshop, the image he had brought to life with his hands, the lady who seemed to flicker between the worlds of the living and the unreal? The resemblance was uncanny, too exact to be a mere coincidence. Was the figure Drowne had so carefully and lovingly carved an embodiment of the very spirit of this foreign lady, perhaps even a manifestation of her grace, her vitality, her soul? Had the artist unknowingly breathed life into an image drawn from reality, only to have it slip back into the fog of myth and mystery? The town of Boston, with its bustling streets and murmurs of intrigue, would never know for certain. Yet the image of the oaken lady, carved with such skill and passion, remained a testament to the fleeting nature of genius, to the thin veil between reality and fantasy. Whether inspired by a woman of flesh and blood or conjured from the very air of inspiration, Drowne's creation remained a timeless enigma, a beautiful mystery that would never quite be explained.
And thus the story ended. If you liked this journey into the worlds of classic literature, do not forget to support us by subscribing so we can tell you more. And hey, if there's a classic tale you'd love to hear told in this suspenseful style, drop its name in the comments below. Your suggestion might be our next chilling adventure.